Right now, Campi Flegrei sits inside a contradiction that is becoming harder to ignore. Officially, the alert is still yellow, but everything about the way this caldera is behaving feels heavier than that word sounds. Seismic swarms keep returning. Pressure inside the system does not look like it is easing. The scientific picture emerging from the latest monitoring work is becoming much harder to fit inside the softer, more reassuring version of this story that many people had gotten used to hearing. For a while, one of the easier ways to explain Campi Flegrei was to frame it mainly as a hydrothermal crisis. In that version, the uplift, the gas, the shaking, and the deformation could be described largely as the result of hot fluids, shallow pressure, steam, and groundwater moving through the upper part of the system. What is changing the picture is the way several signals are beginning to line up. The gas record has become more troubling. The uplift is harder to dismiss as routine unrest. The seismic behavior has become more unusual. The language coming out of key scientific work points more clearly toward a deeper magmatic driver beneath the caldera. One of the clearest windows into what is happening below Campi Flegrei is the Bocca Grande fumarole at Solfatara. The gases escaping there carry chemical information about what is happening underground, and when those patterns begin to shift over time, scientists can read those changes almost like a message from inside the caldera. Recent work has shown that the sulfur signal in those gases has been moving in a direction that is increasingly difficult to explain with shallow hydrothermal circulation alone. In plain language, the picture is drifting away from a simple story of steam and hot water and towards something deeper. The gas chemistry is becoming more consistent with magma degassing at depth, feeding pressure upward into the system. That does not mean an eruption is beginning tomorrow morning. It does not mean lava is already rising toward the surface. But it does mean something important. The engine driving this crisis may be deeper, hotter, and more persistent than the public was encouraged to believe when the easier version of the story was still dominant. Campi Flegrei is not some remote volcano far from daily life. It sits inside one of the most densely populated volcanic regions in Europe. People live on top of it. They work there. They send their children to school there. Roads cross it. Rail lines cut through it. Entire neighborhoods are woven directly into a volcanic landscape that is still changing beneath the surface. Scientists have also been paying close attention to a type of burst-like seismicity that has been appearing inside the caldera. These are not ordinary earthquake sequences spreading out in a familiar rhythm. They arrive in tightly packed bursts, rapid clusters of events concentrated in a sensitive part of the hydrothermal field. Sometimes the warning comes not from one giant sign, but from the way several signals begin to reinforce each other, until the overall picture becomes harder to wave away. The gas evidence has become more serious. The seismic behavior has become more unusual. The uplift has remained persistent. The concern around phreatic risk has become harder to dismiss. None of these things taken alone forces the most dramatic conclusion, but together they create a picture that feels steadily less compatible with a simple yellow alert. And phreatic risk is one of the reasons this matters so much. A phreatic explosion does not require fresh magma to burst visibly out of the ground in order to be dangerous. Pressure, heat, gas, fluids, fractured rock, and the wrong interaction at the wrong moment can already produce a violent event. In a place where people live close to the hazard, that is part of the core threat. So the real question now is not whether Campi Flegrei is active. The real question is whether the framework used to describe this crisis publicly is still keeping pace with the crisis itself. Because yellow sounds manageable. Yellow sounds like there is still room. Yellow sounds like a phase where concern is justified, but where the truly dangerous threshold still sits at a comfortable distance ahead. The data no longer feel that comfortable. When the strongest earthquake recorded there in 40 years struck the caldera, it did more than rattle buildings and frighten residents. It gave the crisis a physical image that no graph or paper could provide. Part of a ridge on the Pennata islet broke away and collapsed into the sea. Schools were evacuated across Naples. Rail traffic was disrupted. Once again, daily life around the caldera was interrupted by the force of a system that continues to remind people it is not dormant, not quiet, and not merely theoretical. And yet, even after that, the official alert remained yellow. That is the moment where the contradiction becomes visible, even to people who do not follow the science closely. Once the ground is shaking hard enough to disrupt schools and transport, and once the landscape itself begins to fail in front of cameras and witnesses, it becomes much harder to persuade the public that the situation still belongs comfortably inside the same category it occupied before. Emergency planning around Campi Flegrei covers a vast urban area with hundreds of thousands of people. Many buildings in exposed areas were not designed for the level of shaking current studies suggest the caldera may now be capable of producing. On paper, the evacuation plan gives the population a limited window to move if the crisis escalates into a higher and more dangerous phase. In a place like Campi Flegrei, the true danger is never only the volcano itself. It is also the mismatch in speed between the volcano and the system built around it. The caldera changes in real time. Instruments detect those changes. Scientists work to interpret them. Committees assess them. Officials decide how the situation should be described. Plans exist on paper, but populations move at the speed of roads, communications, hesitation, logistics, political decisions, and fear. A volcanic system does not pause while institutions catch up. In an area as exposed and densely populated as this one, even a short delay between recognition and reaction can matter enormously. This is why the comparison with the major Campi Flegrei crisis of the early 1980s does not automatically reassure. That earlier crisis remains the modern benchmark because it was serious enough to force a large evacuation from Pozzuoli. But if anything, that history sharpens the question rather than calming it. Recent scientific work suggests that today's gas signal may be even more pronounced than the one linked to that earlier period. The strongest recent earthquake has also exceeded the shocks that define the memory of that crisis. So history does not really tell us to relax. If anything, it tells us that Campi Flegrei can become extremely serious before the broader system around it fully catches up. That is why the yellow alert has become such a loaded symbol in this story. Not because yellow automatically proves the authorities are wrong, and not because every dramatic scenario circulating online deserves to be believed, but because the word itself is now being asked to contain a crisis that no longer feels simple, mild, or easy to fit inside reassuring language. Campi Flegrei is not just making noise beneath Naples, it is producing a thicker and more serious pattern of warning. The gases are telling a harder story. The seismicity is telling a harder story. The uplift is telling a harder story. And the daily reality of living above this caldera is telling a harder story too. That does not mean disaster tomorrow. But it does mean the easy version of this crisis is fading. And if the monitoring record continues to intensify, while the public warning language stays where it is, then the danger is not only what may eventually happen underground. The danger is also how much time can be lost above ground before the response finally catches up with the reality people are already living through. That is the story now. If this is a story worth following, subscribe. We track Campi Flegrei, Etna, and other volcanic systems that can change fast, and we focus on the data, not the comforting version.